You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too. Now added bonus for free. Welcome to Jay's Analysis. We're going to be doing something a little different this week. We're stepping aside briefly from the globalist books just because I had so many requests in the past, probably few weeks, to explain why I don't believe Gnosticism. And because this is, in many ways, a popular lure for many people, I decided, yes, that actually would be a good topic to discuss. And it's going to be somewhat involved of a discussion. And so I would say it would help if you go and watch my New Testament talk as well. It will probably dovetail well with this talk. And you'll have to be patient with me. I'm still recovering from being very sick, and I'm not 100%, but I'm almost back. Nevertheless, Jay's Analysis continues on. We will not forsake, at this point, the weekly discussion. And so if you're listening, of course, for subscribers, the talk is posted in full at Jay's Analysis based on subscription through PayPal or through Patreon. And this first part, of course, is free to anyone. And then you can subscribe at my site for the full talks. So the first thing that we want to consider, I've got several books here that I'm going to go through. But the first thing that I want to say is, let's talk about the lure of Gnosticism. Why does this attract people in our day? And you're not going to see my pretty face today because I've not been feeling well. So I don't look as diva as I usually do. Usually I'm a diva, but after being sick, I'm not really a diva. So I'm not going to be the incarnation of the Gnostic Sophia principle for you today in all of its beauty. I'm going to be the bodiless voice, right? The ethereal voice, like Agent Cooper's Diane. Anyway, so why is Gnosticism a temptation? Well, quite simply, there are many reasons. For one, Gnosticism is useful for alternative manipulation. In other words, alternative religious movements will borrow from Gnostic ideas. Revolutionary movements are often Gnostic in flavor. And this goes back to Fire in the Minds of Men, James Billington. Revolutionary movements from the get-go were essentially Gnostic or Gnostic influenced, and you can kind of see this tradition throughout the history of the West, since the time of the early heterodox Christian Gnostics. So not really Christian, but so-called Christian Gnostics. And over time, these same ideas kind of repackage and resurface, and it's almost like a virus that mutates or something, and it just keeps coming back. And you see it throughout the Middle Ages with the Bogomils and the Cathars And this is something that I've put a lot of time into, so I'm not speaking on a topic that I don't have a fairly academic, pretty high-level academic familiarity with this topic. I've read at length many books on this topic, such as Malcolm Lambert's Magisterial Medieval Heresy, which deals with basically all the medieval Gnostic movements in an extremely scholarly fashion. I recommend that book. Marcia Kolish's book, The Medieval Western Tradition, I think it's called, is pretty good. You could look at Yaroslav Pelikan's set, which covers a lot of this material too. J.N.D. Kelly's book, which covers it. And then, of course, the writings of the Church Fathers themselves, which I'm very familiar with. Put about 15 or 16 years into those. So, so what we want to consider is the lure. Why is this something that lures people in the modern day? What's tempting about it? Well, as we said, when you have a period of discontent, political discontent, social discontent, people look to alternative ideas, alternative movements, or they might look to traditional or conservative movements. A lot of people tend to get sort of dissatisfied with institutional things. So maybe you're in some dead Protestant church that has just now, like the Protestant Church of Sweden, banned gender language in the Bible. Yes, that's in the mainstream news this week through the London Telegraph. Maybe you're thinking, this is not where it's at. Something is off with this ossified dinosaur church that I'm in. And so people are, looking elsewhere, which is understandable. Although ironically, in that case, the gender madness in that fake ass church is actually Gnostic. So, in a weird turn of things, the so-called anti-establishment Gnostic ideas are actually becoming the mainstream. So this is another indicator, by the way, that Gnosticism is ridiculous. And that's really going to be the theme here. What several people requested was do a talk on why you reject Gnosticism. And that's what we're going to do. So, again, the allure, it fits well with alternative movements, right? It's an alternative approach to religion. It appears to have a kind of mysticism to it. It appears to have it actually does have a very syncretistic element, that is blending of a bunch of different traditions together, a kind of perennialist error, and really perennialism, or what's sometimes called traditionalism, and I don't mean traditionalism in the colloquial sense, but in the actual school, people like Fritjof Schuon, René Guénon, and so forth. Traditionalism or perennialism in that sense is an actual school of thought that is in many ways Gnostic, right? So Sufism and these kinds of things all kind of blend together in many. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but in many ways these different groups, these different schools or sects or traditions, quote unquote, are Gnostic. So the allure of alternative approaches to things kind of goes along with an era in which people have been destabilized. So when we talk about destabilization, this is not just a geopolitical thing of, what we're doing in the Middle East through some NGO in the U.S. or something. It's more than that. Destabilization also very much involves religion, trying to disrupt religions, trying to cause chaos within religions, trying to alter religions through ecumenism, syncretism, etc., etc. Masonry, for example, Freemasonry has been very influenced by Gnosticism because Masonry is in many ways just a kind of perennialism. And Masonry kind of tries to disrupt Orthodox religions in many places. At least that's what it's done. That's been its tool, its function. for the last several hundred years, since its modern inception in the Grand Lodge of England and so forth. So you could look at Masonry as kind of an older version of an NGO, or an older version of, a tool of the British Empire or something, to really coax the religions or the existing cultures into conformity with the British imperial paradigm, at least in that case. But of course, Gnosticism as a belief system or religious system is much older than modern Masonry or anything like that. It's older than the medieval sects and heresies. It goes back, of course, to the early centuries of Christianity. And as if you listen to my talk on the New Testament, then you know that what I discussed there was how we know what the texts are and their reliability in terms of the New Testament, at least in an introductory sense. So I don't want to oversimplify the history of all these things, but this is just kind of an overview and my personal rejection and my personal refutation of the ideas of Gnosticism. And as we see, it's going to really, I think, fall apart on many levels, because it's going to, at the same time, attempt to be very rational, at the same time, very irrational. And I don't mean by that it's just paradoxical or mysterious. No, I mean that it's actually going to be a bunch of competing, incoherent systems. And what we're going to see with Orthodoxy and the Church Fathers, especially St. Irenaeus, who was the first really systematic apologist to write against the Gnostics in around 180, what we're going to see is that Orthodoxy is very different. We have a public confession. We don't have a secret esoteric doctrine, which is really the whole thing that's everything that Gnosticism hinges on, is this idea of a secret doctrine that only a select elite have, like, got to have the password to get in the Moose Lodge, and you got to, shake your fingers and put them up on your head and give yourself moose antlers, and this lets you through the doorway, the secret code to get into the esoteric Eyes Wide Shut Moose Lodge, where you eat dead babies. None of that goes on in Orthodoxy, or at least it's not the official teaching of the church. There, of course, can be infiltrators anywhere. I'm sure that there are Masonic members of every church. But at least in our official teaching, and in what we've taught for the last 2,000 years back to Irenaeus, and then, of course, back to Moses and so forth, is that we reject syncretism. And so, therefore, we cannot accept the idea that Jesus is part of an ongoing fluid mythology, is one way to put it. This is what we're going to see with the creative Gnostic interpretations of the person of Jesus and who God is, and the meaning of creation and redemption and so forth. So, in other words, in much the same way as like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, these different cults will use Christian terminology, Orthodox terminology. Those terminologies get twisted around to basically mean something completely different. So it's kind of a bait and switch with words and terms, where Mormons, or Scientology will talk about, they'll even use like a cross, but then when you really are hanging out with Tom Cruise, you find out, oh, this is actually like crazy alien stuff, right? So the cross on the Scientology logo was kind of a trick, right? The Mormon discussion of God the Father or something like this is a trick, because you later learn that in the secret Mormon doctrine, it's, God the Father was actually having physical sex, which is preposterous. And so Mormonism and its many gods, its polytheism, its all of its ridiculous notions, a very bizarre American invention, which of course is why it's stamped with Americanism through and through. It really bears no resemblance to Orthodox Christianity. And that's, of course, why Mormonism's symbology is all borrowed from Freemasonry. But what I'm saying is that Mormonism is a kind of modern analog or something close to Gnosticism in a kind of organized institutional form. But what as we're going to see, especially when we look at Irenaeus, the first 300 pages or so of Against Heresies, Gnosticism is not an organized system, right? And this is supposed to be kind of an aspect of it's an appeal. We're anti-system. Yet at the same time, it will propose these elaborate systems of aeons and archons and gods and really stuff that makes no sense. I mean, you could never decode this nonsense. At the same time as it's saying, we don't propose one dogmatic system. Well, which one of these is true? I mean, is the true Gnostic the one that is the extreme ascetic who believes that the body is evil and that he should only eat beans like Pythagoras? I'm not joking. Or should not eat beans. I think Pythagoras thought that you shouldn't eat beans because they make you fart, I guess, and that's demonic, maybe, because it stinks. I don't know exactly how Pythagoras came up with that, but many Gnostics were influenced by Pythagoreanism. And if you look at Mani and Manichaeanism, you'll find that a lot of these bizarre ideas transferred into Manichaeanism, like the idea that you exhale evil and you breathe in light, or some crazy thing like this, and that within all of creation there's this constant battle between the principle of good and the principle of evil, so it's dualistic. And again, all of this we reject all this. It's just nonsense. And as we'll see, there's a lot of good reasons for doing that. So the first point I'm just trying to again lay out is that the allure of Gnosticism really comes on the one hand because of destabilization in terms of what we know in America and the West as, quote, traditional religions. And that's because of a long-term program to destabilize those religions. And when you look into who has funded Gnosticism and Elaine Pagels and the promulgation of the Gnostic Gospels, if I recall, this is directly under UNESCO. I believe that's correct. And so what that means is that this is being promoted for a reason. And you'll notice that when Elaine Pagels published her book, The Gnostic Gospels, which was really, what started the entire literary community and the New York Times Review and all this crap, touted this as like the greatest intellectual book of the year and all this nonsense. And then she has a whole series about it. And then all these other guys come. Bart Ehrman, the great professor Bart Ehrman, comes forward. And then there were the Judas Gospel, right? The Gospel of Judas comes out. And all this is around 2000, 2001, if I recall. And this is all just nonsense. I mean, these stories are ridiculous when you read these Gospels, so-called. And when you read the church fathers like Irenaeus, it was no different in their day. They were actually having to deal with the same stuff, these pseudonymous Gospels floating around and telling all these wild tales. And then when you read the New Testament, when you read Scripture, you find a very coherent presentation. You don't find a Jesus who is, frying people with his minds like some character from X-Men, and then turning around and saving humanity, and then turning around and, doing magic tricks like David Blaine or something. I mean, it's just really preposterous type stuff that you find in the Gnostic Gospels. And anybody who has, kind of a basic knowledge of, what's in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's not that difficult to figure out this stuff is silly. I mean, they're really outlandish tales. And now I recognize that skeptics are going to say, well, the whole Bible's outlandish tales. And okay, I mean, I understand that you're going to say that from your worldview, your vantage point, which we'll get to critiquing that later when we talk about Genesis and origins and all that, and how your worldview actually is far more fantastical than anything in Genesis, if you're a, quote, skeptic materialist. But regardless, the point I'm making is just that the Gnostic Gospels bear a very outlandish stamp. And then you find a very incoherent presentation of God, of theology. And what I'm saying is that it runs contrary to what would be known as the biblical canon. So when the church fathers are determining the biblical canon over the first 5, 6, 7 centuries, you see that they are working in tandem with apostolic succession, that is the bishopric, the various sees that the apostles established, the churches that the apostles established, and their successors in the episcopate, which is one stool of the church, one leg of the stool. The teaching of the scripture itself, the written text, is another stool. The liturgy could be included there, and then the oral tradition of the apostles, as Paul discusses in his epistles. So these three, the liturgy also might be included under the oral tradition, although sometimes oral tradition actually gets written down. The Creed, Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, these be examples of oral tradition written down. Liturgies that are sung, another tradition that gets written down. Doxologies and so forth. And so what we see then is the emergence of the Apostolic Church, really, again, having a unified body of doctrine. There's not significant differences in the fathers that we revere today. There's a unified doctrine, again, embodied in things like the Apostles' Creed, or the Nicene Creed. And the teaching that you find in that Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed is an outline of the unified doctrine that you'll see in the canon of Scripture. So in other words, when the church fathers over these various centuries are looking at different so-called gospels, and they're saying, all right, we got one here that says, Gospel of Philip. And then we got one that says Gospel of Matthew. Now, we don't know that Matthew actually wrote this gospel. We don't know if Philip, quote unquote, wrote this other one. Let's look at our tradition. Let's look at other texts that we do know are received texts that we've used in our church. Let's say this is somewhere in maybe Greece. And the bishops are saying, okay, the church at Thessalonica says, okay, we have certain letters from Paul and we have the Gospel of Luke. And we have two more competitors here for being part of apostolic writing. And one of them is supposedly Gospel of Matthew. The other one is supposedly Gospel of Philip. And so what would happen is, over time, the church would communicate with the rest of the church throughout the world. Synods and councils would regularly be held. Examination would be done of the text over a long period of time. And Matthew would be accorded, eventually, a kind of canonical status, because it would appear that, yes, the valid tradition is the Apostle Matthew wrote this gospel, even though we don't know the authorship. The text itself doesn't name the author, but tradition says this was the Apostle Matthew. This other weird book, Philip or whatever, just you stick Gospel of Judas, whatever. No, that's completely out of accord with everything that the apostles taught in the tradition and in the received text. Therefore, we will not accept Gospel of Philip because, or the Gospel of Judas, because Judas being a hero or whatever is completely out of accord with all these other texts. So it's not rocket science we're talking about here. It's, if you've spent a few years in these books and in these texts, it's not going to be too difficult to figure out when one of these texts is just night and day fairy tale compared with what we call the unity of Scripture. The idea that there's a unified, coherent message to this book. We might call it the Book of the Covenant. Now, if you doubt me, that's fine. You can take the time if you want to and read Elaine Pagel's book. It's pretty preposterous if you have a bit. I mean, the only people who would be persuaded by this are people who really have no biblical knowledge. I mean, that's really the only way to put. I mean, it's not that difficult to figure out. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but I mean, again, we've got several other books that we can look at here. So maybe, you're not that interested in Elaine Pagels, or you think she's not that great. I've got many more. I've got Sean Martin, who has another popular book, which is pretty accurate, trying to defend Gnosticism. It's called The Gnostics, the First Christian Heretics. I've got Elaine Pagel's other book, Adam and Eve and the Serpent. And as I said, I got a lot of other secondary scholarly works that you could look to that I've listed before. Probably need to add all these to the recommended reading page, but I don't want to overwhelm people. Anyway, so that's what I would have to say about the allure. The allure is many faceted, and partly because of the loss of the sense of traditional religion. However true or false the traditional religion that you happen to be involved in is, or that you weren't involved in, maybe, who knows, the shaking up, destabilization process as part of the age of transformation, the age of change. And that's part of the modus operandi of a lot of big foundations of UNESCO. A lot of Rockefeller ecumenical money has gone into these kinds of things. Now that these people have been destabilized, let's move them into something new, because they're going to want something new. So let's make it Gnostic sect, XYZ, New Age sect, which in many ways borrows from Gnosticism. Far Eastern religions, which in many ways are also similar to Gnosticism. On and on and on. The Matrix, the Matrix trilogy, for whatever insights it may have, it is also ultimately just a Gnostic fable, as we'll see. And this is going to be, I think, the big stickler point between Orthodoxy and Gnosticism. It's not just Jesus, but as I argued in the talk with Tim Kelly, it's really a question of creation, because the Gnostic worldview, if we want to call it that, the Gnostic madness, basically begins with an alternative version of Genesis. So rather than any kind of orthodox formulation of Genesis, and we're going to set aside Darwinism here. Well, actually, in many ways, Darwinism is Gnostic, but we're going to set that aside just for the moment, for the time being. We're going to say, the Orthodox position of basically God creating Adam and Eve, that they're in a malleable state wherein they can learn virtue or turn to vice, and then as a result, either affect a good state of being upon their descendants, or a negative state of being, the fall. And the serpent in this case represents, for us, for the Orthodox position, a previously occurred rebellion of some sort amongst the angels. So because Satan is a creation of God, he is an angel, one of the highest angels, and in the Orthodox tradition, because of envy of man and the plan for mankind, and especially the incarnation of the Logos of the Son, this provoked the devil to envy, and hence his hatred of man. And so when he fell, which is described in the Apocalypse, a third of the angels fell with Satan. When he fell, he decided that he would attempt to destroy man as well. So the Garden of Eden event with the temptation, so forth and so on, in our scheme, is, as probably most of you know, done by an agent of evil, that is Satan. Now, on the Gnostic scheme, all of this is reversed and changed, and we got to rewind. We don't start with, what's going on in the garden. You got to rewind to creation itself. And the idea here is creation is not good. The problem isn't even this crazy stuff about, snakes and Adam and Eve. The real problem is, quote, creation. It's creation itself that is mankind's problem. So here what we have is the idea of what they call Yaldabaoth in numerous versions of the Gnostic system. And Yaldabaoth is the name for the demiurge. And here you'll recall this starts to sound like Plato. Yes, if you heard my Plato talks, this is similar to what Plato talked about. Now, there are parallels between Platonism and Gnosticism, because Gnosticism would, in many instances, not all, but in many instances, again, there's many Gnostic sects, so we're speaking in broad terms here. Gnosticism, if we can speak broadly, would prefer the idea that God is this sort of unknowable, distant principle out there, perhaps, the real God, the true God. And he doesn't willingly create. He emanates. He just kind of emanates these forces or principles. And from these emanations, there are these different gods and goddesses and consorts and so forth. And creation in this world was a kind of abortion. And this is literally how it's described by Gnostics. So this whole world, this whole universe is an abortive mutation, right? And it happened by some sort of split between the principle of, as we said, the demiurge and whatever the beyond all principle, absolute, unknowable God, right? So this demiurge created this abortive, evil universe, and in the process of this nonsense, somehow was alienated from his consort, or the principle of Sophia, right? Wisdom, the feminine principle. So what we got was the evil patriarch God, creator God, is imprisoning people in matter. He's imprisoned the divine spark or energy in matter. Matter is a tomb, and only the awakening of Sophia, the divine feminine principle, can reinvigorate and re-establish the inner divinity of the convert, right? So if you're not a Gnostic, then you're one of those that are asleep. Right? So now you're starting to see how this appeals, or could appeal, to the alternative media camp. Those that are asleep. Are you awake, man? All right. Now, I'm not saying that there's there's nothing wrong with that terminology. It, again, just depends on what you mean. Do you mean awake in the Gnostic sense? Then no, I guess I'm still asleep. You can still call me profane, bro. Do you mean awake in the Orthodox sense? I would say yes, and we believe that's what we call baptism, right? Illumination, right? Chrismation, illumination. So we use the word illumination. That's fine. Enlightenment, etc., etc. It just depends on what you mean, right? We don't mean illumination by Lucifer. We mean illumination by Christ. So, in the same way, what you've got with Gnosticism is really this sort of mimicking, this parodying. It's a parody of what is in Orthodoxy. So as we saw, there's a parody of creation with this Gnostic creation myth. You have texts like the Pistis Sophia, which, as I said, is about this sort of regaining of the feminine principle. And this means you finding your inner divine spark and your inner female principle, and on and on and on. I mean, it could just mean anything, right? It just goes on and on and on. It means whatever the Gnostic teacher in front of you wants it to mean, basically. So it's a great system for a lot of con artists and scammery and goofballs and hucksters and mountebanks to sell you on whatever cult they're trying to make up. And as we should also point out, the Pistis Sophia and the rise of the Gnostic Gospels, wouldn't you know, it has a direct correlation to feminism. And many of the feminist writers actually make this connection themselves. They will talk about the anti-patriarchal sentiment, right? The idea that Yaldabaoth is the God of the Old Testament, the creator God, God the Father, and that's who feminism is ultimately warring against. You can actually, the Collins brothers have a really, really good article on feminism and Gnosticism that you can read, where they detail all these quotes from prominent feminists. And the prominent feminists themselves are saying, we are Gnostics. We are borrowing from Gnostic ideas because these Gnostics fought the evil, masculine Jesus and masculine God the Father and masculine presentations in the book of Proverbs and, so forth in Psalms and so on in Genesis to bring back the goddess principle. And this is why we like Wicca and witches and abortions are so great, and because we worship the goddess. So now some people say, oh, this is dialectics, right? It's the masculine versus the feminine, blah, blah, blah. Well, not everything is dialectics, right? So there's such a thing as truth and falsehood, right? We wouldn't say that truth and falsehood is itself a dialectic. No, it's not. Not everything is within the process of dialectics. Some things stand without it. The principle of numbers are not dialectics. The principle of right and wrong is not dialectics. Truth and falsehood is not dialectics. Certain things are dialectics, though, right? Like revolutionary movements of left and right. That's dialectics, okay? Masculine and feminine, those are not dialectics. They are opposite principles, but it really depends on what you mean by opposite principles. Right? I mean, in other words, I can be different from something without being in tension with that thing. So, in other words, it's complementary, right? In God's design, masculinity and femininity are complementary, and they're intended to be unified. However, when it comes to theology, when we say God the Father, we are not literally ascribing, this is the heresy of Mormonism, we're not literally saying that God the Father is like a man. No, not at all. We do not know the being of the Father. All we know is what has been revealed to us from Christ. And that is the only way that we know God the Father. And we know the Father through the Son. This is what Jesus teaches in the Gospel of John, right? And we know the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. And that's the only way to know God. Now, we're going to set that aside for a moment, though, because we're still dealing with Gnosticism and Gnostic texts. So let's look at, as we said, again, the reason I bring that up is because you have to understand that these modern popularized movements are popularized for a reason, right? Rockefellers, World Council Churches, National Council of Church, they're not pouring their money into feminist theology, goddess theology, all this kind of stuff, and the Gnostic stuff, UN, UNESCO, Gnostic stuff. They're not doing that for fun. They're doing that because they want to promote these things. And when you go to Vanderbilt University or any of these Ivy League schools or Harvard, and you look at their religious studies department, their theology department, that's all they are, is this crap. They don't know anything. They are completely lost, lunatic. They're in a cult. They're in the same cult as all the other wackos. Right. I mean, I'm not kidding, by the way. I mean, you go look at these pages, their religious studies department, and you're going to find like lesbian Bible studies, the lesbian gospels. I mean, it's just total insanity, right? Transgenderism in the Bible. That's what you're going to study at Harvard and Vanderbilt. So, these institutions are essentially satanic. There's no other way to put it. And the money that goes into these institutions for, the promotion of feminist Gnostic theologies is, again, from these big institutions. Now, why do you think all these big families and institutions promote feminism and Gnosticism? It's not hard to figure out, because it's a tool of social engineering. And it's a tool to wreck and destroy traditional beliefs. Again, it's not rocket science. Why do they want to do that? Because they want control. What stands in the way of their systems? Well, it's systems that run contrary to that worldview, right? So if you believe in patriarchy, if you believe in the primacy of masculinity, and that femininity, while it is very important, it is not to be placed in a role above masculinity, right? That is biblical teaching. That's the way God set up things. Doesn't mean that women are evil or that they're lesser beings. It means that there's a position of authority, and that authority is based around the authority that God laid down. That's why we don't have female priests. And there will never be female priests, ever. There's no female bishops in Orthodox theology. And anyone who does that, they will be automatically excommunicated. It has nothing to do with being mean. It's just the way that Jesus decided to set up his church. And the way that Paul laid down the apostolic rules. So it is what it is, right? I mean, to be angry at these things is really to sell yourself short, right? So a lot of women get mad about these things, and it's like, why are you mad? What is it you think you're missing out on, right? And so then they turn to conspiracy theories. Oh wait, I thought conspiracy theories were a joke. No, they turn to giant conspiracy theories that are ridiculous, like the patriarchy conspiracy theory, right? This is what all the feminists believe in, this patriarchy conspiracy theory. I thought, so now this is an establishment promoted conspiracy theory, right? One of the ones they want you to believe, like 9/11 or something, the establishment's own conspiracy theory. One of the great ones is feminism. Marxism is another great establishment conspiracy theory for millions of years, right? The bourgeois, I'm joking about millions of years, but it might as well be, since Marx was a rabid Darwinist. The class system is everything, and that's been this long conspiracy of oppression for most Marxists, we'll say. And in the same way, feminism, this long train of keeping down women through evil patriarchs. So, let's see. When we look then, as we said, so we talked about creation here. And as we said, we're talking about the lure of these different movements in our day. Let's move now to the next mimicry that we find in Gnosticism, which is a kind of either excision of the entire Old Testament or Torah, law, and prophets and writings, or a remaking of them, we might say. If we look at somebody like Origen, who you could say is kind of Gnostic since he was a Platonist, where Origen's extreme allegorization basically destroys the veracity and historicity of the books of Moses and the Psalms and the prophets, basically making them worthless and meaningless. So if we do this, and many people in modern Christianity who think they're Orthodox, right, who think, I'm speaking across traditions, they find this very appealing for whatever reason. I think because they're ignorant of how to understand these texts and what exactly is going on. And most people are really tripped up by the continuity of the Old and New Testaments, and it's really not that difficult. Orthodox theology really has this nailed down. We have icons of all of the Old Testament saints: Abraham, Joseph, Daniel. They are saints with us because we're all part of the same covenant. So, it's not that difficult. The book of Hebrews makes this very clear. But you have all these evangelical and weirdo sectarian ideas that have also had a lot of money behind them that have spread, dispensationalism and all this nonsense, which has muddled things. And so people are confused given all these crazy sects and heresies. But point being, the veracity and historicity of the Old Testament is 100% Orthodox. And you're not supposed to question that, by the way. So all you Orthodox out there who challenge me on this, by the way, everyone who's challenged me on this has been refuted totally. You'll find very simply that Jesus makes this very clear in the Sermon on the Mount, as well as many other places. He says, for example, the scriptures cannot be broken. He says that not a jot or tittle will pass from the law until all things are fulfilled. He is talking about the Mosaic writings. Jesus affirms Mosaic authorship in numerous places in the Gospels, as well as does St. Paul. Jesus affirms the existence of Adam and Eve as historical persons. Jesus speaks of the fall of Satan. These are all historical events. Jesus many times affirms the historicity of the events of Exodus, etc., on and on and on. So what you idiots who try to dabble with this stuff, which is Gnostic, we're just going to be clear here, you're dabbling in Gnosticism through what's called Marcionism. Marcion was one of the early church heretics who attempted to get rid of the Mosaic texts as part of the Bible. And many in so-called Orthodox churches attempt to do this. One of these idiots on YouTube, Archbishop, so-called, he's not an archbishop, I don't know what he is. He just calls himself this Lazar Puhalo or whatever his name is. I've seen him say many times that the Old Testament is not historical. I think Stephen Freeman claims, I've seen him claim this. I don't know if he still does. I don't keep up with these people. but making these just outright Marcion statements, like Marcionism. Like, we really can't follow the Old Testament because it's a mean God. What idiots are these people? Where did you go to Bible college? Where did you learn this the most ridiculous theology that anybody with like a basic, I mean, Protestants could tear you apart with this. I mean, so you're really damaging yourself here, okay? Learned Protestants could eat you for lunch with these kinds of stupid statements, because all they have to do is, again, show that you're completely incoherent with the way Jesus interprets the law and the prophets, and the way Paul interprets the law and the prophets, right? And once you've done that, then, in comes higher criticism, and I guess Jesus didn't say all those things, did he? Right? So, and no, you can't say that's just Protestant, picking of scriptures. You can't do that. Sorry. Because the church fathers do that very thing. The church fathers use scriptures to do apologetics. So, I mean, grow up. Come on. You don't even know what you're talking about. You're not even in the game if you're being that idiotic. So Stephen Freeman and Lazar Puhalo or whatever, these guys are clowns, and you need to either inform them that they're wrong about the Old Testament. You can dig up the old Stephen Freeman article on his blog where he says that I don't keep up with these people. After a while, you eventually just kind of filter these people out. And what you notice is that over time, people either wise up or they fade away. They go off into their weirdness, and they eventually kind of fizzle out, and they either expose themselves or they end up, going off into some other weird religion. You just let people do their thing. You don't have to really worry about it. Stuff works out. So anyway, the point of this talk is not to go after people. Again, this stuff is not that difficult to figure out, but because there's so much confusion, people are confused. But it's not difficult to figure out that St. Athanasius is very adamant about the historicity of the Bible and the Old Testament. St. John Chrysostom is. St. Cyril of Jerusalem is. St. Cyril of Alexandria is. St. Hippolytus of Rome is. St. Irenaeus is. St. Ignatius is. St. Maximus Confessor is. St. John Damascus is. In all their writings, we find consistent presentations about the inspiration, the authenticity, and historicity of these texts. So you people out there who criticize me, the burden of proof is on you to show that your higher critical positions or your Marcionite positions are somehow going to fit into and they don't, right? But again, a lot of you people aren't really in this for the right reasons. And a lot of you people actually work for foundations, right? You work for think tanks and you work for big money. So you're frauds, and you'll be exposed in due time. But for those of us who are actually sincere and interested in what's true, and we don't want to be duped by cult leaders and feminists, and we don't want to be in some ridiculous Gnostic cult, we are going to investigate the claims of Gnosticism. And as we've seen, they are very bizarre, at least as we considered the creation mythology that they mimic. And as we moved into the Old Testament and the history of Israel, that's all either allegorized into some weirdness, or we have the heresy of Marcion. By the way, you're a heretic if you defend the idea of Marcion. And then when we move to the New Testament, we have the character of Jesus totally reinterpreted. Jesus is a kind of, he's many things in these multiple Gnostic texts. This is kind of where we get ideas of like Jesus as the Christ consciousness, right? There's not an actual historical divine incarnate Son of God. there is the Christ consciousness, where there was this dude who was an avatar, right? Jesus the avatar. This is like a Nestorian position, an Arian position. Jesus the prophet, right? A kind of Islamic position, who showed us the good way. All this nonsense. No, Jesus is the Son of God. He is the great I am. And that is the whole message of the gospel. And that's why we have Saint Athanasius, right? And not Saint Arius. Arius is the heretic who said that Jesus was just the good old dude, man. If you believe Jesus was a good old dude, you're not a Christian. That was why Santa Claus punched Arius in the nose. I'm halfway joking there, but of course the legend is that Saint Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea socked Arius in the schnauzer. And that really encapsulates the whole point of Christianity. You deserve to be punched in the nose if you teach that, because that is blasphemy and it's the complete destruction of Christianity. But it's under the guise of trying to look Christian, right? This is the Jehovah's Witness dogma, same teaching as Arius. And so in the same way, Gnosticism really just repackages the Arian heresy into a mystic Jesus, right? The Jesus that is the cutout, Jesus that is the like potato head, like make Jesus into whatever you want. And that's not the real Jesus. That's the whole point here, is that we have a definite presentation of who this person is in the scriptures, and not just the Gospels, by the way. This is another one of the prominent errors and heresies. The Spirit of Christ is in the Ten Commandments. Have you not figured this out? Right? It's the Spirit of Christ that's telling the events of Genesis. Right? That's how there's typology. Right? Read my article on typology. So, it's like Hebrews says, why are we having to teach the basic principles of Christ over and over again? Like, you should move on to the meat and not have to deal with this gobbledygook, which is the baby food. This is Gerber stuff, right? I'm not trying to rebuke people that are, new to this or whatever. I'm talking about people that claim to be Christians and all this stuff, that think that they're, quote, Orthodox. And like 8 years ago, there was some guy, Jesse or something, I can't remember his last name, and we were arguing about, he's like trying to tell me the events of of Kings, that they weren't historical. You can't know that they're, and I'm sitting here saying, like, do you realize how idiotic this is, dude? So if the events of Kings aren't historical, then King David is not historical. And then King David having a descendant, right, to sit on the Davidic throne is not historical, and that's Christ. Stop being so stupid. You can't hold these doctrines, right, and at the same time turn around and deny the unicity of the scriptures. What does Jesus say? The scriptures cannot be broken. So in other words, it's all or nothing. Like, you have to, like, you commit to this or you don't. Like, there's no, like, it's not a buffet. It's not Shoney's Big Boy, where you get aspects of the buffet that you want, and then, I don't want that other part. Yeah, no, it's like, it's a full meal. You have to eat it all. So Gnosticism is crucial to understand in terms of modern heresies, because in many ways it's kind of the pan-heresy. It's the ultimate heresy in our day. And it comes in many forms, or I guess maybe it's more proper to say that it has influenced many modern heresiarchs, false teachers, con men, cultists, etc., etc. And they're going to repackage in some way the Gnostic approaches to where Jesus is like the mythological figure, right? As we said, Christ consciousness. Jesus is the good dude, right? Like Big Lebowski or something. Jesus is the revolutionary figure who fought the establishment, right? The Jesus of like Marxism. I'm not joking, by the way. This is how it's presented, like the Jesus of liberation theology, the Jesus of Martin Luther King, where he, like, his whole mission was this social gospel of like healing racial division. No, that's not the mission of Jesus. I'm sorry. Now there is, in the sense, right, according to Galatians, in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. But guess what? Nobody, except complete lunatics in maybe the modern Gnostic Church of Sweden, nobody believes that Jesus came to destroy gender distinctions, right? So when that verse says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, in no way, not until post 1960s, would any boob ever come up with in his mind the stupid idea that verse is somehow supposed to mean that everything is erased in Jesus, right? So, well, Paul says there's neither slave nor free in Christ. Well, he also says there's neither male nor female. So if slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, so if there's no races, no classes, then there's also no genders. And this, by the way, is why the Gnostic, Marxist, socialist, feminist, UN, New Age model of things loves this kind of aberrant liberation theology, social gospel, transformation, rip-off mimicry of Christianity, which is Gnostic, because it so well destroys things. It is the mimicry of the true things. So the truth is patriarchy, whether you like it or not. The truth is there are ethnic distinctions, and God created us that way. Read the account in Genesis 10:11 of Babel, and God divided the nations for a reason. And he did that so that there wouldn't be giant Babel empires that tried to destroy ethnic distinctions, which is exactly what Babel was designed to do. And in the same way, that's exactly what the attack on gender is intended to do. Now notice the same principle, the same spiritual force behind all the same. Globalism is allied with feminism, is allied with the attack on gender and the attack on ethnic distinctions. Why is that? It's because they're all motivated by the same unnatural force, which is demonic. Why might that be? Well, quite simply because, as we said, Satan hates mankind. He hates human nature precisely because human nature is what Jesus became incarnate in. Jesus took on human nature and deified it and raised it, and ultimately in the eschaton, or the end time, the eternal state when everything is transfigured, the human nature will be raised above even angelic nature. That is the teaching of Scripture. It's the teaching of Hebrews and the teaching of Paul's epistles. And because of that, the envy of the devil, which Jesus talks about in John 10, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Because Satan envied man, and the dignity and glory that God had in store for man through what he would do in Christ, Satan thus hates human nature. Is this not obvious? So what principle or force do you think might be operant in the world over time to consistently promote what types of things? Unnatural things like bestiality, which attempts to destroy the distinctions that God put in place between man and beast. The distinction between male and female through aberrant sexual practices like homosexuality. The distinctions between ethnic groups which again, God created at Babel. So all these attempts to destroy these things, a distinction between man and women, male and female, right? Outlined many times in the book of the law, Moses, and in the New Testament and church fathers. So the satanic principle is about inversion. It's about attacking what is natural. And so for us, creation is good because God created and he pronounced it good. There's no dualism. God doesn't create evil. There's no opposing force that God created. God created Lucifer and man in a state where they could freely choose one or the other. And so what the force of evil is not some thing out there. It's not like if you watched Time Bandits, if you remember at the end of Time Bandits, evil is like this black charcoal that's cooked in a microwave or something. That's the joke, the Monty Python joke. And so what they're putting forth in Time Bandits is actually the Gnostic view, right? Evil is matter, or it's some substance somewhere. If you watch Prince of Darkness, the John Carpenter movie, right? Evil is the glowing green goo underneath that weird church, right? Evil has some sort of substantial form or existence. Well, we don't believe that. We believe that the only sense in which evil, quote, exists is merely as a turn of the will away from the good. That's it. So Satan and the demonic forces have basically committed themselves to a perpetual turning of their will against the good. And as a result, they seek then to recruit those into their ranks, born of Adam, to then, by extension, fight against human nature as well. And that's why you see for example, the globalists, they promote the Tower of Babel, the image of the EU. They promote transgenderism. They promote the destruction of children. They promote the ruination of youth. They promote all forms of degeneracy. They promote bestiality. They promote everything disgusting because they're motivated by this very principle that we're speaking of. So that is also Gnostic. Why do I say that? Well, many of the Gnostics, we find out, actually taught the same idea. They taught that the good guy in the Old Testament is Lucifer, which follows from their logic, because if the creator God is the bad guy, Yaldabaoth, if he's the bad guy, then who's the good guy? Well, it's the devil, because he's trying to tell man in the garden, if you eat of the tree, then you will have your eyes open and you'll be like God. And that's God's trying to keep you down, man. Right. So this is Saul Alinsky in the garden. This is why he devotes the book. What am I trying to say? Dedicates the book to Satan. Rules for Radicals. Why? Well, because Satan's the first revolutionary, right? He's the first radical. Why? Oh, because God's trying to keep you down. No, he's not. It's like saying, rules against bestiality are trying to keep you down. That's preposterous. Like you're protecting people, right? Now, not all rules are good, but some rules are good. And, rules against bestiality are good rules. So what we're getting at here is that, again, you start to see that there's a consistent pattern here of the revolutionary, the one who wants to overthrow things, to establish a new order, a new unity, right? All of these slogans of the revolutionary. Ultimately, this is, right, who's the first one? Satan. Satan's the first revolutionary. And Saul Alinsky understood that. So in the same way, we can look at Gnosticism and its pro-Lucifer attitude, and they actually do tend to say, yes, we believe that Lucifer is this enlightening angel, which is ridiculous if you read Isaiah, because Isaiah says Lucifer is the fallen angel. So another one of these Masonic Gnostic lies is completely not true. It just all rests on total biblical ignorance. So the Gnostics are promoting then as we said, the idea of a Luciferian principle. And then Jesus in this system is kind of like this weird, not just a Christ consciousness, but also at times a kind of Lucifer figure. I'm not joking. These people are crazy. And what they will try to say is that the Old Testament is fighting against the New Testament, and Jesus is then the God of love, and he came to get rid of creation. So then now Jesus is transformed into this Gnostic principle, right? To fight against the prison of the body. And then, oh, guess what? Well, obviously ideas like the bodily resurrection and the crucifixion, that all has to go. Because if Jesus came to save us from matter or material forms, or from the body, or from creation, then none of that stuff in the Gospels makes sense, right? So this is where we get the complete transformation of the message of Christianity itself. It is, of course, then anti-Trinitarian as well, and everything, as we said, is inverted. So you get in Gnosticism all the baggage and the terms, but it's all code for like new meanings. And that's what's crucial to see here. So these are some of the reasons why I would reject Gnosticism. And there's a whole host more. And we're going to look at those as we get deeper into this, and we look into the writings of St. Irenaeus, and as we look into the writings of some of the promoters of Gnosticism and the Gnostic Gospels in the second hour. This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. Thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more, you can subscribe at my site for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year.